Community Culture Unveiled, uncovering and discussing the secrets of mental health in oppressed communities. Hosted by a girl for all girls.
Welcome to Community Culture Unveiled. I am one of the co-hosts, Taquela Muhammad, introducing my fellow co-hosts. We have psychotherapist Teresa Teacher, clinical psychologist Dr. Monique Muhammad, Sister Amelia Muhammad, and back again on the show, we have neuropsychologist Dr. Christopher Howard. And if you did not tune into the last show, you missed a real treat. The show talked about trauma and what trauma looks like and how it manifests and how to recognize it and handle it effectively. The show beautifully reflected the different types of trauma and how it's passed through our genes through something called epigenetics, which is something I just learned, which is the study of how our behaviors and environment can affect the way our genes work and the impact of trauma throughout history. The show also spoke about chronic stressors and living in environments that lacks resources to survive and how that can have significant impact on causing different forms of trauma to manifest. A few key points that stood out was that many of us are dealing with trauma, but we don't know how to vocalize what we are experiencing. And also, when something impedes in our ability to function, to eat, to sleep, to have relationships, to get along with others, and to develop friends, you have to start looking at root causes. And that came from Sister Teresa. So that show was so powerful. You can find us on all social media platforms, including YouTube, under Community Culture Unveiled. Now, today's episode, we are diving into racial trauma and what it looks like on an individual and community basis. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our beautiful sister, Teresa, as she takes you further into the show. Peace.
I want to thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful opening and intro.
Yes.
Anyone seen the last show? I attempted to cover for an intro, and I wish I would have sounded as good as that sounded, but that's why have our beautiful Tequila because she can do it like nobody else can. But I do want to jump into this because everything now that I'm hearing, kind of her summation, the reason why I say it was good because it sets us up for today's show, which is racial trauma. Everything that she sort of described, when you really think about it, doesn't it correlate with racial driven trauma? You can sort of trace back some of that to that, right? So, what I want to do is because instead of just totally jumping into discussion, I think it's very important to sort of break down really base definitions that you can find on any Google, anywhere, as long as you know how to apply it in the context of your people, of your culture, and of your life, and also look at it from a broader perspective. So I'm even going to pull from just a general source, nobody of specific culture, race, or gender, which is the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, PTSD National Center for PTSD, which they've done plenty of studies on because of veterans. They break down what is racial trauma, and I'm going to read directly quote them. Racial trauma refers to the emotional impact of stress related to racism, racial discrimination, and race-related stressors, such as being affected by stereotypes, hurtful comments, or barriers to advancement, highlighting barriers to advancement. And we're going to get more into that because that's like a huge discussion of why we are maintained into this sort of racial trauma that we're in. Racial trauma can refer to a specific incident or racial discrimination or the ongoing harmful emotional impact of racial discrimination that builds up over time. People can experience racial trauma from something that happens directly to them or from seeing others mistreated because of their race. Coverage of events caused by racial discrimination in the media can also be upsetting, as we see in the recent current events, which we can totally dive into as well, or you can imagine in your head at this point. And repeated viewing of frequent media accounts can amplify those feelings. If you watch the George Floyd video over and over again, you would have felt sort of new information coming up inside of you, or it should have, built up some sort of emotional response every time you watched it, every time you thought about it, every time somebody brought it up. It was like you were for me anyway, I was reliving the trauma myself. I even put myself at the scene and what I would have did if I was there. I mean, so this broad definition can really be broken down, and I think today's discussion we'll go into that. What are the impacts of racial trauma? Well, we're talking about community culture unveiled and uncovering the secrets of mental health. So we're going to make this relate. Racial trauma can lead to an increased risk of physical and mental health problems. Emotional difficulties
Mhm.
such as stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD can impact functioning, as she said earlier, in school, work, and at home. Relationships with others may also be affected. People may worry that others dismiss their concerns about racial trauma. It is normal and understandable to be negatively affected by racial trauma. So today, I just want to be clear. This is a disclaimer. This is not a show about slavery and blacks. This is a show about how racial trauma has had the most impact on different communities because we are a show based on communities and what racial trauma has done and represented in your community. And if so be it, it lands on the history of blacks in America, so be it. But it is not the only people, it's such indigenous people of the United States who have also endured slavery. So we want to talk about more so current impact of racial trauma. So I'm going to open it up to the floor. We can jump on in. When I said some of those things, does anybody have like an emotion attached to any of the points that was made just in the basic definitions?
Yeah, I was. I'm glad that you brought up, well, what we call vicarious trauma, right? When you talk about experience of seeing the effect that happens to us, even though I may not have experienced something directly, but I saw it on social media, for example, or I saw it on the news, and I see it repeatedly. That actually does have an impact. That is one of the things this rash of police murders that we've seen of Black people, there's been a lot of attention that has been paid to in the literature how that has vicariously impacted Black people. So, yeah, that was a point I think that's important because sometimes we feel like if it didn't happen to us, why am I reacting to it? Why, that's there's something not normal about me having this impact.
No, there's actually something quite normal. You should be happy that you're having a response because it means that maybe that's your human nature should be kicking in that whether it happens to you or not, this is
That's
not
right.
right. And if it doesn't, if you don't have an emotional response, you need to ask yourself why.
Right.
Well, you know
I,
what? I
I,
think
I also, I'm sorry,
no.
just
Go
real
ahead.
quick, just really quick, and just tying that up. I just wanted to make mention that if you look at the symptoms of trauma and you look at the symptoms of vicarious trauma, they mirror each other, right? And I make that point to say that even though sometimes we think about it as a lesser than form of trauma, that the impact would be less, it's actually it impacts us very much the same. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that in that way. Sorry, Dr. Chris.
No, you're fine. I think both of you guys raised an interesting point, though, right? Like because I think we're at the stage of life of the social media era where we're inundated with like black trauma. And it's almost to the point where it's one has become a fetish because every time you're on social media, whether you're on Instagram, you see the random videos, you're on TikTok, you're on Facebook, where like videos just kind of scroll, you see this level of debauchery, right? And it goes back to the point where we should feel something, but it also gets to the point that it has been sensationalized, and so we don't necessarily feel it as much as, oh, okay, this is just another video of kids fighting or police brutality or just ratchet debauchery, whatever the case may be. So then the question becomes, what is the appropriate response? Like, because we become so accustomed to it that it doesn't no longer bother us, but then we take a step further and now we come to expect it. That's what we do. And that is a problem in of itself.
Mhm.
I just wanted to add to that, Dr. Howard, that you're correct. It's like we have become desensitized to it, and so with that being said, it's like all that just happens, and so it disallows you to connect with it. because you've become so desensitized and you see it so often that it's like it's almost expected, especially within our communities. We can't connect to it anymore because it's at our fingertips all day, every day, like you said, on social media. So we just be like, oh, okay. So it becomes easier for us to go out and act that same type of behavior on and criminalize ourselves because we see it all the time. So it is not about, oh, the police is shooting this person or that person, because we have become so desensitized to it.
Right. You raise an interesting point though when we talk about community, right? Because now we kind of look at the de-evolution of the community, right? So even if
Yeah.
mother wasn't on track, father wasn't there, whatever the case may be, there was a point in time where we had a level of community where maybe your neighbors were dentists, doctors, teachers, whatever the case may be. So even if you lack something at home, you could get it like right next door, right across the street, wherever the case may be. But because we don't have that level of community, there's nothing to disabuse what we see, right? We're all privy to be at an age where we know, okay, you know what? There's more to the blackness, the black experience, our community than this, right?
Yeah.
But this new generation, they don't have that privilege, right? So one can almost say is like they think that this is all that there is, and this is why it's perpetuated, you know, and that's problematic in of itself.
Mm.
Mhm. Agreed.
What do we think are some of the more problematic, though? I mean, we talk about problems in our community that reflect residuals of racial trauma. I mean, do what are we looking at, though? Um, what are we looking at when we're talking about institutional racism that impacts us in a racially trauma way, um, and how that impacts our community, meaning access to resources. Many people, let me go back. Let me go back because I'm having a lot of thoughts in my head and I'm trying to not be all over the place because it's such a full topic. Um, I'm I'm sort of leaning towards how racial trauma is keeping us oppressed, right? Meaning
Mhm.
that the post traumatic slave, there's a book written, actually our producer gave it to me and I wanted to jump into this book, the post traumatic slave syndrome. What is the most impactful, or what's been known now as the most effective slavery method? And when it comes to mine, I'm thinking mental, right? And we deal with
Mhm.
mental health, but the mental enslavement, you got to have a lot of power to enslave individuals from a mental perspective and not keep them in a physical bondage. And what are some of those things that keep us traumatized in the constant trauma of that? Becomes the
I want
question.
to, yeah, I want to add to, and you all had some really good key points, and I'm gonna reflect on my own self. So my son is turning 18 in January, and one of the things that bother me is just the fact of, okay, I'm excited that he's learning how to drive and all that, but then on the other hand, I'm thinking my son will leave out of this driveway and drive down the street and may get stopped just because he's a black male. And so that fear is impeding me from even wanting him to drive
Yeah.
and function. And so it's not just on like an individual basis. I read it's on like a historic, on a systematic basis. So it's everywhere. But that's, for me as a mother, that is pulling me.
Mm.
Yes, and I would just like to add to that. I was having a conversation with someone, and they were in a setting, and they were talking about how they was just talking about their children in the classroom setting. And one of the teachers said that she was told or overheard another teacher saying that I don't have a problem with little black and brown boys when they're little black and brown boys. It's when they get 9 and 10 years old is when I have the problem, because I no longer see them as children. I then began seeing them as predators. So the mere fact that you do not, we are boys, don't have an opportunity to be just that, to be children, to be able to play, to be able to just be themselves and grow into the young men, the teenagers and young men that they should be able to become. But because of that racism, that implicit bias that's already in the mindset of those people, that our children and our boys are not allowed to be able to just be children. And so that is a problem. And because we don't have the community, because we don't have the villages anymore to help in that area, this is, it's just going to perpetuate itself if we don't do something about it.
So let me ask everybody a question though, right? When was the last time you turned on the TV, the internet, social media, whatever the case may be, that you just saw a picture, a positive image of an African American woman? Like, just, I mean, of course, we got the Michelle Obama. Of course, we got Oprah, but that's really like two people, though, right? And I'm sure there's a few others and stuff. But my overall point is that whenever you get onto like social media, TV, whatever the case may be, it's hard pressed to be able to find like a positive image of an African American female, African American male, particularly when considering the amount of debauchery that you see. Why is that important? See, if you want to willfully like destroy a community, what you have to do is dehumanize it. So if every time that you turn on like any social media, whatever, and you see just like debauchery, I think everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? You see the
Mhm.
gangsterism, you see people like can barely form sentences, like you just see the worst of the worst of the worst of the community. What ends up happening is that it's like, well, if they don't value it, why should I value it? Right? Like if there's trash in the street and you see people walking past it, then the next person says, well, why should I pick up trash? I'll just litter too. So when you have this level of dehumanization, that just kind of perpetuates the problem, right? Because I don't have to respect you because there's nothing to respect, right?
Mhm.
So, and I'm not going to turn this to a biology lesson, whatever, but just there's an amazing article in Time Magazine, and there's a couple other published articles. And essentially, what it was saying is that African American, particularly African American men, they excite the part of the brain the most in individuals just with respect to emotion. So essentially, what that means is that when a cop, when a teacher, when authority figure, whatever the case may be, sees an African American man, particularly of stature, it ignites that whole emotional response, right? So when the emotional response is ignited, then you're not thinking rationally, you're not thinking whatever, but it's fight or flight, right? And this is when you start to see the problems with the police, whatever the case. So it's almost like you have these two things working in concert: the dehumanization of African Americans, and then you have this whole neuroanatomical standpoint where people just have a higher susceptibility to being afraid of people of black. So when it comes together, it's easy for somebody to pull a trigger and kill a Trayvon Martin in juxtaposition to a Dylan Roof where they get McDonald's and all this other stuff, right? So yeah.
Yeah.
So essentially, what I'm hearing you say is that social media and media in general perpetuates racial trauma across the line. And when I go to Ghana and I'm in Africa, the way they see American blacks is through the eyes of what they see on social media and on media. And oftentimes, I'm defending the fact that that's not our full culture and that's not our full people. But when we, as you said, dehumanize us and lessen us to being buffoons, when we're lessoned to be just objects as women, which, as you raised the point, almost what I was thinking is a nation can rise no higher than this woman, but a culture can rise no higher than this woman. So when you degrade Black women, that means that you've taken away the hierarchy of that civilization because she is supposed to be the highest point of civilization, technically. So they stripping us down. They stripped the Black man down, and basically they flatlined us, which is another form of racial trauma through media. So it's like a perpetuation of these images, which I read off earlier in the definition. That is the mainstream racial trauma that I think attack on our community is social media and news and the derogatoriness and what they're allowing and what they're even allowing us to sing about and rap about, what they allow us to put out all reflects this sort of indirect or direct form of racial trauma that we're putting on. I mean, imagine that your children are 7 and they think their purpose in life is to back it up and to do all these things. I mean, that's it, I don't know if anybody else is offended by that, but it just angers
Absolutely.
me.
I'll
It
tell you
That's
angers
true.
me.
I'll tell you how it works though, right? Because if I dehumanize you, and let's say, God forbid, like one of your young nephews or whomever gets hurt or killed, and you're trying to raise awareness, then it's like, well, how do we rally behind you? Because we don't
Correct.
really value you, right?
Right.
So that's
Correct.
how it works. It's not just, okay, it's this or that, but it's like when we need to move as a collective or we need to find an allyship, people are reticent to join because they don't value you, and they're like, well, because he's not human, he doesn't have the privilege of making mistakes. So why was he wearing
Right.
that? Or why didn't he do that? Or why was she wearing this or that? Or whatever the case may be. So that way you don't get justice, though, right? Because the next step to that is like, if I don't get justice, then I can't depend on the system. I don't depend on the
Correct.
system, then I'm a renegade, I'm a pariah, I'm all these other things, which further perpetuates the archetype that you're just the savage bad person that always wants to buck the system, right? So one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that we can't just focus in a moment, but we have to see what is the trajectory of the dehumanization of racial
Mhm.
trauma.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
I think another piece of what we're talking about is important to raise, and that is that despite all the dehumanization that is happening, and we know that is happening, and we know it's very deliberate and intentional that it's
Sure.
happening in that way, but it there has to be a complacency there as well. And what I mean by that is that without our buying in to the images, the narratives that are abound about us, it cannot penetrate. So there is the internalization of what is put out there, that dehumanization. So not only is it something that's being done to me, I buy into the fact that I am less than. I am
Mhm.
not human. I am.
Let's
Mhm.
talk
So
about
when
that.
I do
Absolutely.
that, that's where that for me, that's where the trauma lies, right?
Mhm.
Because
Yes.
you can do all that you want to do. If I don't internalize it, I cannot be injured by it. So the
Mhm.
injury happens with that internalization. And I think that's extremely
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that brings us back to our mental health and how do we internalize these sort of things that we're talking about more so from that perspective. And we're talking about self esteem. And there's articles on the high need of validation of Black men. There's many articles on the level of validation that Black men need. I was reading and studying on it yesterday. I wish I could pull it up, but for next show, maybe, possibly. But how do we internalize that, Monique, is the biggest question, and how does it break down our self-esteem and our ability back to functioning? When you impede somebody's functioning, you disable them, you disarm them from moving
right.
forward in life. And that is the main reason why people come to me for treatment. It's all about we've been given productivity as a remedy for us in certain communities. That is my number one remedy in my practice is productivity, because productivity fights against that in which is coming against me to disarm me.
Mhm.
As long as you stay with kinetic energy, meaning energy that has life,
Mhm.
it's harder to bring the stream up when you have the stream coming for you and you're constantly moving and moving and moving. So I just, let us not forget, this is serious talk. This is more of the implication or the design to break our functioning down in whatever manner, whether it's dehumanization, this, whatever means necessary. There is an agenda, because if it
Yeah,
wasn't an
absolutely.
agenda, we wouldn't be in the condition that we're in.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And what ends up happening is when I internalize all of those negative images that are put around me about me, it creates self limiting beliefs.
Yep.
Right. So I don't now have to, they talk about this in Miseducation of the Negro. He talks about how when you put a certain mindset in a person, you no longer have to put chains on their hands or on their feet. They
Yes.
will chain themselves, so to speak. And we call that in this field a premature cognitive commitment. That ultimately we develop what is called a premature cognitive commitment to our being less than. And just one quick example of what I mean by that. an experiment that was done where that baby elephant is tethered to a stake in the ground. And the baby elephant, because it's a baby, can't pull, himself away from that stake in the ground. And so it learns that that radius that they have is the only radius that they have, and they begin to limit themselves. But as that elephant grows, it can easily break the rope or pull the stake out the ground, but it won't do that because it's already made a commitment that this is my radius, and I don't go any further than this. And in so many ways, Black people have created, because not just we didn't do it in a vacuum, right? But because of the society that we live in, we have created our own self limiting ways of functioning in this world because this is our lane, this is all we have, this is all we're going to get, and that's all we strive for. That's it.
Well, let me
Mhm.
say something to that though, right? So, name a time in history where there's been black prosperity that hasn't been followed by white tyranny. Like any time there's been like, if you think about, we get free. The next thing you know, you have the vagrancy laws. Then we get the civil rights. In '65, then the assassinate king. For every iteration of success, there's been something that kind of pushes us back. And I think we're going to talk about this like a little bit later, like just with respect to the redlining and stuff, right? And so I sit there and I say to myself, is it the chicken or the egg, right? And I'm not putting anything on anybody else. It's like, okay, well, yeah, there's a level of free will that we have, but then it's like whenever you have the prosperity, when you think about Harlem when it was rolling, Detroit's Black Bottom, you think about Southside Chicago and everything, that it would always reach like a certain level of heights, then there would be something to undermine it, to quell its power, to ameliorate its power and stuff, right? So then the question becomes, it's like, okay, what can we do that's going to perpetuate us to a better quality of life? And not saying that all blacks live in destitution or whatever the case may be, but then also it's like, okay, well, what other systemic things that can we approach? How do we approach it in order for us to have a better life, right? Because when the crack epidemic happened, it came into our communities, right? And we didn't get help. So we had to depend on the church, the funeral homes, whatever the case may be. And we had to have some sort of level of resolve in order to figure that out. But when the opioid crisis happens, and like now you start to see everybody wants to get involved and they want to be treatment, we're not going to send them to the prisons or whatever. Was it like in Philadelphia, Kissing Avenue or something like that? Maybe I'm saying it wrong, but it's like a whole bunch of other kids like who are struggling with opioids and dope and stuff, and they get like resources or whatever the case may be. So can I righteously like chastise somebody and say, "Hey, you're doing drugs, you're doing whatever, you're not doing what you're supposed to do," knowing that there's something systemically in place that's going to undermine them, or do I don't know. So I mean, that's just something I was thinking about.
Mm, beautiful,
I mean,
beautiful.
I love the point about how throughout history there have been a myriad of various examples of how when Black people, we finally began to gain some traction and gain some, a power and so forth in this country, how white people have tore us down, literally bombed our cities, killed people. And so, they've always operated from this no sum game where that if you gain power, that means I'm losing power. And so whenever I see you gain a little bit, I've got to fight you to get it back. And that's been unfortunate. And it's something that I feel like white people are beginning to wake up to now. But we've got to understand that that's the game that's being played here. That our success or our upliftment actually feels threatening often to white power structures. I'm sorry.
Wow.
And how do we respond to it though? That's the thing. We don't know how to respond to it because
You
like
said
like
word
like
We got to
understand.
you
bring
said,
community back. We got to bring community back. Like that's the only way that it works. And like whenever you try to build something, like in the community, people are like, well, I don't eat at black establishments because it's bad and da 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 da. But then, no disrespect to the Hispanic brothers and sisters or whomever, you'll go over there and maybe be mistreated, but then it'll be like, oh, okay, well, that's whatever, whatever, whatever. So it comes back to the mind frame. Is like, are you willing to tolerate disrespect, blatant disrespect? But then once you're back in your own community, now you have a higher level of critique. So the question is, how do we bring community back? And I'm not trying to evangelize or anything, but I think a
Mhm.
lot of it kind of starts in the church. And I'll tell you why the church is important, because it's a place where people are able to congregate from different walks of life. I'm not like from a metaphysical standpoint or anything like that, but it's like, oh, okay, well, Joey's thinking about going to temple, but because we're at the same church, Sister Muhammad's a teacher or a professor at temple. So now it's just like, oh, okay, well, I want to introduce you there, right? Because you're in the same community, same congregation, and just a position to, hey, I want to go to Villanova or Temple, whatever the case may be, but I have no connection there, right? Or Joey, he's only selling drugs because he doesn't know how to get into the trade school. But Mr. Blackman, he's been running trades throughout Philadelphia, wherever the case may be, for a while, right? So it comes back to community because it allows you to have information without these major gaps, right? And that way you can mentor the young men. Like
Yeah.
now you know how to box, so you don't have to pick up a gun. Like
Yeah,
to the
you
system, you know how to dress, so you can be presentable when you go into interviews or when you do different things. Because
yeah.
nobody's teaching you these things with the de-evolution of the black family, so you're not knowing, and you think it's acceptable to be talked a certain way or to do a certain thing or have your pants falling down. And then when you're not making money, you have nothing to contribute back. So then you have to ease into the debauchery. But when you have
Mhm.
community, it's basically having like a level of mentorship that's easily accessible.
You seem passionate about that, Dr. Christopher. I see you are going into our interventions, but I feel your energy. But the question then becomes, you can't control someone who understands who they are and what the agenda is placed against them. And when
Mhm.
we talk about that, yes, we can offer remedies after it happens, but how do you talk about not getting yourself caught up in agendas that are meant to harm you? And so if we can be proactive, one is that, of course, right? How do we gain understanding that you're actually in a traumatic racial environment? Every day you walk outside as a black person, if you live in any inner city of an urban community, you are in ongoing racial trauma
Absolutely.
that has been set up and designed to keep you in that community. How do I evolve past that? How do I push past that? No, we're not blaming everything on slavery. We're not going to keep blaming, quote unquote, the white man, of course, for all these things. However, only the cream of the crop, or those who have strong self knowledge, is going to be able to penetrate the traps. And the way that you don't make it past the traps is staying ignorant, is staying preoccupied with things that don't propel you in any positive direction. So I can go to church, I can go to the mosque, I can go to the synagogue, but if I and get help, but if I don't first understand and have a working knowledge of self and separate from those forces, separate from that energy, which then brings me oppression, then I'm just really just putting a band aid on it and going back out there without the right tools to really navigate. I mean, what do we feel about this? Let's dig deep, because I'm like, okay, like, where are we going with this as far as self
And,
awareness and self development? Go ahead, Dr. Monique.
and yet, listening to what you said, and yet it's still true that no man can rise above the condition of his people, right? And so, yeah, there might be one or two of us that kind of get the game and understand how to navigate, but that doesn't do anything for us collectively. So, going
Right.
back to what Dr. Chris is saying is so crucial, that we have to function in unity with one
Mm.
another. We cannot, what there are numerous ones of us who have kind of made it through the cracks, who have attained levels of
Success.
status,
Mhm.
financial success, and so forth. But that's done nothing for us as a people. And it
Yeah.
cannot do anything for us, not becoming president of the United States, not becoming the richest black person. None of that can do anything for us as a people. It has to be us functioning as a unified. So, going back to what Dr. Chris was saying, that collective a community is so crucial to what we need to do to find liberation, upliftment, and so forth, that we're seeking. It is in that community.
Yeah, I mean, think about the civil rights movement, though. Like think about it, though, right? it was a group of people who maybe had a high school education, like when you think about the Deep South, Lowndes County, different places like that. But the goal was liberation, not for themselves, but for the children's children, right? And when they got together with Dr. King being almost a messiah figure, they changed legislation, you know, and that's what happens when you have a level of community that even if you're saying, I'm not going to march with the protesters, but at the same time, I'm not going to discredit them, that's community. Like, and I
Mm,
get like there's a level like community is not monolithic, and I know that's an oxymoron, but what I'm getting at is that because everybody's invested like in the same goal, what ends up happening is that it creates a force to change, right? And so, to your question, where you say, well, how do you do that? You can go to mosque, you go to church, you go to temple. What you have to do is one, it starts early. This is
yeah,
what you're doing. This is the goal for your life. See,
yeah,
the thing about having a goal is that it gives you direction on which to go. Because if you don't know where you're going, you can't get far. And then it's easy to get distracted by things that don't matter. Right. And we're living in a dangerous era because we're living in the misinformation era. You
right.
get on social media or whatever the case may be, and you just get inundated with information that's not correct. But all of its design is just to dissuade you from doing what you're supposed to do. And it's easy
Absolutely.
because you don't know. So
Absolutely.
it's about saying, what is your purpose in life? And I'm not trying to be existential or I'm not trying to have like this pie in the sky idea, but it's one of those things where you have to intimately get to know somebody because that's what mentorship's about and say, what do you want out of this life? Right?
Right.
What does your 10 years look like? You're 18. What does 28 look like for you? And if you can't think about 28, that's a problem. You don't have to go to college. You don't have to, but you have to figure something out about your life because if you don't, you develop a level of passive suicide because you start taking unnecessary risks because you don't see or you don't have an expectation of things to come, right?
Absolutely. I'm all about
So
that.
deep. So deep.
Absolutely, all about that. But who are those people who, and I'm just really antagonizing, right? Because I feel like if I antagonize, we'll get to some really key points, which is one, who are identifying those people who are going to be the mentor and what skills do they need to have? Whether it's good mental health, good knowledge of self, good cohesion, love for self. When you think about what the individual that has to be a mentor must have, we can think about solutions in that, about just arming yourself as an individual to be that leader. But how many people want to be a mentor in their community, I guess, becomes the question. How many people want to gain knowledge of self? How many people want to understand what community looks like? How many people want to arm your community with strength and power? Finding those individuals seem to be a long lost thing. I mean, finding people who are not just talking about, oh, we used to be like this and we used to be like that, and the community used to be like that. But my neighbors talk about it all the time. They like, oh, they're like, we used to do it and they used to be like that. But I'm like, what we doing now though? Like, who gonna do what and who gonna get there? And if I was, you know what I mean? Like, how I want to give as we go into interventions, I want to kind of give us some realistic, practical interventions that you can arm yourself with, as Dr. Chris talked about mentorship. But what does mentorship, Dr. Chris, really look like? And what do you need to have as an individual to be a good mentor, a good example, a good leader in your own community? Okay, let's even start in your own household.
Okay,
And
so,
mhm.
oh, go ahead. My bad.
No, go ahead.
All right. So, my thing is, what are you good at? Like, so, because like when I work with like young people and stuff, and I say something about the church, and they're like, "Oh, janky pastor, da 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 da," or they don't have this, they don't have that. I get it, whatever. You know what I'm saying? But my thing is neuropsych. I went to church in the west side of Chicago, in the heart of the west side, and they didn't have any mental health programs. But I'm like, I'm getting my doctorate in neuropsychology. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start like, just Alzheimer's luncheon, whatever the case may be. And then next thing you know, the community comes because grandma, grandpa, uncle, auntie, they're afflicted with some sort of, mental disease, right? But before I could talk about Alzheimer's, everybody wants to know, well, what's going on with the kids? Well, yeah, it's a varying form of depression or anxiety, bipolar, whatever the case may be, or racial trauma, that sort of thing. And because I'm the expert, then I can address it, right? Because that's what I'm good at. You know what I mean? And then I start bringing other friends and other people along who, okay, well, you know what? You're not neuro, but you're a social worker. So now we're going to start plugging people in with resources, but we're going to keep it in house. So that way, there's not a paper trail, just in a sense, like not anybody's like trying to do anything different or bad or break the law or whatever, but it's about getting into a space where you can understand what's going on, right? It's about recognizing what are your gifts. And so I've seen this before where, okay, you know what, my dad does HR. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to go to the Boys and Girls Club and we're going to have a job fair. Hey, you smell like weed, your pants down, whatever. You know what? I'm going to tell you what you need to do so you can get a job later on, right? What are you good at in order to do these things? And then there has to be a call to invite people. If you got a network of people and you see a young man or a young woman who's not doing what they're supposed to do, but you know they got to, hey yo, I got somebody. Let's da 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 da. And it's not going to be easy. Like I think thinking that's going to be easy is somewhat
Mhm.
disingenuous. But it's the willingness to put in the work to say, I want this better community. And I can't fault somebody that's older because they did what they were supposed to do. What they did in the 60s and the 70s isn't going to work now per se. But what can we do? We got a podcast or you got people, whatever. How do we like take what our skills, our gifts, and help those who are least in need?
Yeah. And I think we need a more hands-on approach as well, as to what you said, Dr. Christopher, because it's it's many people that have those talents and gifts, but they don't want to help. We don't want to help one another. We don't know how to help one another, so we're holding on to these gifts and talents while the youth are acting up, but there's nobody here. Like Sister Teresa said, they like, oh, I used to do this when I was younger, but the boys need you now. We got all these boys walking around the community and you're mad that their pants is sagging and they're going to do this, but who's really taking the time and effort to say, hey, I want to teach them, I want to train them? Well, what can we do? We're so afraid. How do we get out that fear mentality so that we can help one another? How do we get out of it?
I think that we need to start investing into our communities, into our communities again. Like Dr. Howard was saying, we have divested enough. So I think that now we need to invest in our communities. And like, Dr. Howard said, whatever your talents are, whatever you're willing to give to ensure that our young men, our young people are invested in. And they are our best commodities. If we are not investing in our children, we're going to continue to get what we see in the streets that we always tisking about. So I think that if we allowed ourselves to invest in our communities, whatever that might look like for you, in your church, in your mosque, whatever that may look like for you. I think once we start doing that, genuinely investing in our children, see that we care. You know what I mean? Because sometimes we really don't care. We do it for whatever our motivations might be. But these children, they can tell. They can tell if you really, really, really care about them. So I think that if we really start just investing in our children, one child at a time, and let the word get out, and deal with them and handle those traumas that they may have had at home, in the schools that they don't get the opportunity to talk about, and give them those opportunities to talk about them. I think then that's the approach that we should start taking in ensuring that our future will be secure. But it has to start with us just investing back into our communities and into our youth.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is consistency, right? Like you can
Mhm.
have the huge gala one day, then 3 months you don't do nothing, right? So
Mhm.
then it's just like, all right, same thing I've always experienced. But it's like, okay, what can I do so I could get like uh a congregation of kids where everybody's here. You know what I'm saying? Oh, okay. Teresa, she's a counselor. Chris does the neural stuff. Okay, so you know what? We just want to do a little bit of testing and see who has ADHD or not. We're gonna try to do some stuff to see who has trauma, whatever. You know what I mean? We're gonna get the PlayStation, the games out, hot dogs out, whatever the case may be and stuff. And that way, yeah, it's fun, they're safe, but also we're about to start doing some work to kind of see what's what. What are we working with? What are we dealing with? So I know it sounds grand and I know it sounds just like this revolutionary, but it's not. Like it's things that's been done for as long as I can remember and stuff, but it's a way of getting people there and just trying to figure out what's what and just implement the resources that you have. Right?
Sure,
Mhm.
sure. So one of
Think
the words that
also,
kept one of the words we haven't thrown out a lot is just to get somebody's feedback on inner. This is all about our interventions for your community, interventions for yourself. Is that love? Nope. There is such a lack of love within
Mm.
ourselves, number one, and that's what leads us to so many poor mental health decisions. Because we've stripped away through racial trauma, through racism, because of all these factors we're talking about. We sort of stripped our love for self away and our self-worth, so we make all these very decisions that don't reflect anything of self-love. Therefore, we're asking individuals to to gather communities who have they even figured out if they have the self-love. So I'm just throwing that out there, like when we increase our level of love for ourselves and we exude that love unto our children and to our families and into our community, you when you really love something, you're going to be upset when something comes against it. That love will make you seem like a superpower. And when we have and increase that love, and I think we have to talk about the ingredients when we talk about interventions. What are some of those ingredients? We can talk about like what a role is or how we can sort of gather together and do this, but what are some of the ingredients that we need to have from a mental health perspectives within ourselves to be able to mobilize a community, is what I was sort of kind of leaning towards earlier. Does anybody have any interventions for yourself? Because I really want our viewers to take away things that they can personally pour into themselves when we talk about going out into our communities, mobilizing.
I think one a key
Well, I
thing,
just,
key
I'm sorry, go
ingredient.
ahead.
I'm sorry, Sister Miller.
No, please go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. I think a key ingredient that we need in combating this racial trauma, um, kind of it is drawn from understanding what how racial trauma functions, right? So we understand that racial trauma, one of the things that it does, it disconnects us from ourselves. It disconnects us from who we are as a people. When I say, I'm saying as a black people,
Come
right?
on with
And
it.
it tells us that if you're not European, you're not okay. If you're not white, if you don't look like this, talk like this, walk like this, think like this, that you're not okay. And black people, we have our own way of vibrating in the world, and it's
Mhm.
not a European way. But we have in because of the society we live in, we become disconnected from ourselves because we are constantly taught from when we are babies that we are not okay the way we were born. So we
Say
learn to internalize that as being a truth, that lie as being a truth in our lives, and we conform to it. If we understand that, then we also understand that a key ingredient to
that. Mhm.
combating that is knowledge of self.
That's
We
right.
have to go back to understanding who we are as a
Who we
people.
are.
What is our essence, right? Which connects with that love piece, Sister Teresa, that
Mm.
you were talking about in a major way, right? Because we
Yes.
can't love that which we don't understand. So we don't
Woo.
understand ourselves in a very deep way. So I think that's a key piece there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I was looking for that. I was looking for somebody to bring that out. Go ahead, Sister
And
Amelia.
pouring into our youth, pouring into our children. Like the brother said, when you get on social media, all you see is something negative. Like I had to really think in my mind when the last time I seen more of a positive influence when I get on social media of a black male. And
Or
it
what?
took, it was like, yeah, or a woman. And so we have to start like, and like you also mentioned, Sister Teresa, about the validation, the constant need of validation for our men and our boys. And I even see it with my young boys, like they have to know at a young age that they are loved, that they are appreciated, that they will be something. And I have to constantly pour that in them. Like I see them, if even if I, fuss at them or something like that, I can see that they already feel like, I can't do nothing right. So I have to be like, okay, wait a minute. Let me pour back into them. And so we have to be doing this at a young age because we see us as mothers. If you're a single mother, you frustrated, you going through
Yeah.
certain things. And so you're just going off out of frustration. But we don't know the effect that it's having on our boys and children. And then now they're going into the world and they're really just looking for some peace. Whether it's I need to smoke some weed or I need to do this. I need a form of peace to make me feel better about myself. I don't have to deal with the constant bombardment of drama and chaos. They don't want to deal with that. So we have to heal ourselves on one stance, and then we also have to pour love into our boys, our men, and in our own selves. So
Sister
Absolutely.
Mila.
Amila. Amila, you have some words?
No,
Yes.
I'm no, I was just going to. You said everything I wanted to say, Dr. Monique, and because I was just going to add to that that when we talk about love, we have been used to now in this generation, this dispensation in time that we don't. Our love is existential outside of ourselves. Love for us equates to hair, equates to a car,
Mm,
equates to clothes, and we
yes.
don't do the internal work.
Yes.
So how can you we that's what we see. Our young girls replicate that because to them that's what love is. As
Mhm.
you have your lace front, if you got your nails, if you got your BBL, for them that's what love is, because that's what men are telling us that's what love is. That's what it's supposed to look like. So if we do that work on the inside, and
Right.
then it will eventually manifest on the outside, where we don't need the hair, where we don't need the saggy pants, where we don't need the Jordans, where we don't need any of those things to validate who we are, because we've done the work on the inside that will
Right.
reflect who we are. And so all of those things won't even matter. So I
Right.
think that when we talk about love and doing the work, it has to be internal, and so that it can be manifested externally. That's it.
Absolutely. That was a great way to sort of sum up our interventions, racial trauma, the interventions that we need to fight against the impact that is continuing, and until society changes hands in some kind of way, however you envision that in your head or you've learned about, until it changes hands and authority into a new way, the system is designed to continue to perpetuate this sort of racial trauma. It's as you can see on at current events, that is real. And what will you do to arm yourself with the proper tools? So, as you can see, we probably could go about 5 shows of this racial and how it looks in so many different phases, because it impacts so many different communities. I don't want to leave out of my indigenous people, as my dad's side is from Mexico, and I understand the history of the indigenous people who were also enslaved, and the breakdown of taking away who they were, first by even calling them Indians. So, when we look at just the totality of that, we have to come back for a show 2 of racial trauma, part 2, with your guest, and maybe even a surprise personality. We don't know yet, but we got to do a part 2. So I want you to stay tuned, because we're just going to take a brief break, because we're going to answer some questions that were sent in for the show. I'm just kind of going to take a little bit more time to answer the questions, and then we're going to go ahead and close out. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're back for our questions. We're going to go ahead and jump in and answer some of the ones that were sent in. So I'll go ahead and jump in and sort of, we have so many that came in. I'm just trying to see which one would be the most impactful for us to answer. One of the ones that were brought up was, um, hmm, let's go ahead and jump into this one, since we just finished talking about love. How do we improve motivation when you feel constantly oppressed? How do we improve motivation? So these are more practical ways on which you can have some of your own control. So how do we improve motivation when you feel constantly oppressed? Doesn't matter what community. Let's go ahead and jump in.
What comes to mind immediately for me is the fact that a lot of studies show that racial socialization is is supportive, it's protective, and so often our motivation is decreased in the face of racial trauma because we're not adequately guarded against it. We're not adequately propped up, right? To be able to confront or combat it when we are when we're facing it. And so the penetration of it causes us to feel despair, apathy, depressed, I can't do anything about it. So I don't feel a sense of motivation. And so that racial socialization, I think, is a key piece of that, of being able to improve that motivation, understanding what is this that I'm dealing with, understanding the game, so to speak.
Okay, awesome. Do we have any others that want to talk about improving motivation when you feel oppressed by any type of energy or any type of force related to racial issues? I'll tell a quick story, which is one I don't know if I mentioned this before in a previous, but I find it to be relevant going into job interviews and how others don't have to prep for job interviews the same way I feel like I've had to prep for job interviews. Going, being, being a professional at whatever level I'm at and going into, like, say, hospitals and meeting with a panel of other doctors and other professionals, and nobody looks like me on the panel, and it's like 10 people. Before I even go in there, even though it doesn't affect me anymore like that, I have to think about what I'm gonna wear, what I'm gonna say. Oh, wait, let me wait and put my braids in later after my interview. I know how many people say I'm gonna wait and put my braids. Well, I'm just gonna get some braids, but girl, I got this interview on Friday, so I'm gonna wait to put them braids in. Oh, okay, yeah, girl, wait to put them braids in. And just like what purse I take, what jewelry I wear, how I speak, how I respond. Like, and I can tell when I come in there, they looking at my resume, they not expecting no black girl, right? And so you can tell they're like, she lied. You can feel the energy that I just lied on my resume. Matter of fact, I'll tell you, even go further. The head of psychology, this big time Indian psychologist, they were like, he wants to meet with you. He's head of all our programs. And the first thing he said to me, he had my resume in his hand, just like, this is intriguing. And he started questioning me about things on my resume that only somebody that have went through that and had worked in those entities could even dialogue about. I was like, oh, I got this. I see what time it is. He saw he wanted to meet me and see if this is true on this resume that I'm talking about. So I just find it to be funny. But I have some people come to therapy, they're traumatized by workplace racial trauma. They don't know how to handle it. I'm always coaching them about, look, you are a king, you are a queen. Everybody's going to be amazed at your brain. You're just going to have to accept it. Well, it shouldn't be that way, but it is. Do you have the power to change it? No.
Yes.
One of the interventions for yourself is accept the condition of the world to a point that you can operate in it. And when you
Mm.
stop preoccupying your brain about what shouldn't be and be the change and be the new paradigm for what just their mind sees, then that's just it. You feel empowered. I feel empowered when I leave. They don't even have to give me the job. I'd be like, yes, you thought I was a white girl coming in here, didn't you? And you got food. And I feel confident. I feel
Yeah.
very confident. I don't That's how I increase my motivation. I just be an example. I try to stay humble and I try to represent the best frame of mind and the mindset that I have. And I try, but first I have to invest in myself to be motivated. If I don't invest nothing, no education, or you just can't show up and be like, I'm it with no backup, with nothing to show to why you're it. You just want people to accept it. That's not the best. So improve your motivation by pouring into yourself, as we said earlier.
Mm.
And I would just like to add that just building community based interventions that address these kinds of harms with people that look like us. I think that if I'm not saying that we can't incorporate other cultures and things like that, but I think we need to have these community based interventions for people that look like us, that's relatable. You know what I mean? That you can sit and they know that you care and they know that you hear them. So I think that if we had more community based interventions that will address these traumas, that will address that oppression that our people feel, then I think that could be the start of people of loving themselves, loving ourselves. If we start just there, if we start with just community based interventions and letting our people know, "Huh, I got you. That I got a cousin, I got an uncle, I know somebody that talk like you, that look like you, that understands you. I'm you, right?" And I think that if we do more of that, or we can start there, that's at least a start.
Okay. One of the other questions that came in, if no one has any more for motivating, is how can policies be racist? And That's a huge question. I almost feel like we should sort of talk about in the next show. When we talk about policies, many people are wondering, like, what do you mean policies? But I mean, not the more obvious ones, but even the whole debate on healthcare in America. Healthcare in America, like, why wouldn't you? Because poor people need healthcare. But when it transitioned to pre existing conditions, when that clause was brought up,
Mm-hmm.
that's when middle class white people took a rise, right? Like those, their children are struggling with, um, you know, other type of illnesses that they couldn't get coverage because they had a pre-existing condition. And I believe that sort of pushed it. But imagine if it didn't have that clause in there, poor people might, people who look like us, may be still sitting around with no health care, which is racial trauma of imagine not going to the doctor because you can't afford it or because your mind doesn't value yourself enough to need it or to desire it.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else on policies?
Well, I think to just a simple word to that point. How do you know when policies are racist? Um, that whenever the outcome produces racially disparate numbers, you're looking at racist policy, right?
Yep.
If you look at the end result and you see that it's a list of negative things and black people are at the top of it, or a list of positive things and black people are at the bottom of it, which is often the case, you're looking at you're looking at rather a racist policy because of
Right.
what it's producing. We saw that with the um, um, crime bill, right? And the disparate outcomes that that created for many of us. So
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So I think it's interesting with policies though, because sometimes they're a little bit more ostensible, or in other words, like you just kind of see them blatantly. Like Cabrini Greens, there was like a project in Chicago on the north side, over there, right by the Gold Coast, right. So the city stopped picking up trash. So as a result, trash started to pile, and then you would get the rats and roaches. And so people would just say, and it goes back to dehumanization. Oh, black people can't take care of their neighborhood. No, the city of Chicago didn't pick up the trash, right? Racist policies. When you think about redlining, where people save and they build up by the bootstraps, and then they couldn't get a home in suburbia, and racist policy, but it's not so much that they couldn't get a home in suburbia, it's that you disenfranchise the south side or the west side or whatever the case may be. But people say, oh, black people just kill each other, and because they kill each other, why should Black Lives Matter? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you disenfranchise like the local hospitals, then African American develop a disproportionate rate in terms of birth trauma. Then it's just like, well, is it because black people are unhealthy, or is it because there's no doctors in the area that can provide adequate health care? Right? It was something to the fact where African Americans, they would get a home in like a different side of town, wherever the case may be, then they would get hit with all these charges. Then whatever wealth that they had was destroyed, then they had to move back, and then the next family would come. So all these other groups of people would get this money off of us, but we have nothing to show in return. Or you think about, I think it was like 1965. I'm tired, so I forget the bill. But what it was that it gave other individuals opportunities to create businesses, get loans from the banks. We weren't able to do so, so we had to go through different groups of people in order to get our needs. And so what ends up happening is that that lowers their level of wealth. That's how racial policies work. Is that sometimes it's a little bit more blatantly obvious, and sometimes it's a little bit more surreptitious, but the common denominator is always the same, is that whatever wealth that we have is always undermined when we can't do different things. Yeah, like,
Yeah, I get you. I mean, it's not just policy, it's also adopted practices that are not technically a policy, but companies adopting acceptable practices and nobody says anything, like companies putting unhealthy food in poor communities. They don't, when I went today to the hood to buy me some veggie sausages, but I wanted a certain brand, they didn't. They had morning. They had one little stanky little brand they had. But if I go on the north side or north south loop, Chicago, I got about 20 different brands. So because we don't say buy, they don't put those things or healthier versions of stuff. So that's kind of common practices that are acceptable.
So,
And we do nothing. You know what we do? We drive 45 minutes to the better store and get better food.
But we can discuss one of the biggest racial policies was the Constitution of the United States.
Okay, okay. Well, girl,
So that was one of the
that's a whole
biggest racial policies
that's a
enacted on the black man and woman in the hells of North America. So we could talk about all the hospital policies and redlining, but one of the biggest racial policies that we know up to date is the United States Constitution.
mhm.
But we'll
that's
have to talk about all that right now.
whole show. So as we
That's a
move
whole
into,
show.
someone asked, what is institutional racism? Policies, practice, procedures, and culture of an institution or system that work better for white people and cause harm to people of color, often advertently or unintentionally. Institutional racism. So racism is another form of slavery because anytime you restrict an individual from living their own choices or their own chosen path that they want to, by keeping them out of certain things that propel them, that is another form of slavery. So all for all of you who think we're not in slavery, I want you to read on that and think about what the answer to that is. We're getting to the end of our show. I know that we have so much more to talk about, and I know we need to have our closing points. I've said enough. I think I want to save the rest of what I have for the next show, but I'm praying that everyone doesn't just listen to podcasts, doesn't just listen to social media, that you do your own research, do your own reading, feed your brain with information that fuels you to be a better you and fuels you to develop a better community. And the name of our show is Community Culture Unveiled, but to unveil a better community culture within your immediate surroundings by doing some of the things that we talked about today, that we gave you some good remedies for. So that is it for me. Did anyone else have any closing remarks, brief closing remarks before we close out? And just remember, we have part 2. Anyone? No?
The show was awesome. I just learned a lot. That's why I'm sitting here like, wow, it's just so amazing. I mean, knowledge is power. So I think that we definitely need to just share and let our family hear, different things that we don't recognize. Trauma, sometimes we function like it's normal and it's not. So we need these shows and we need to encourage our family members to heal. So
Yes.
Just one last thing, like, there's power in therapy. And you can't help anybody until you help yourself, and sometimes you have to recognize what's going on with you, because they say misery loves company, and if you're not in a good space, one thing that you're going to do is that you're going to try to make somebody miserable also, and that could be anything, and we don't need that anymore, right? So a part of knowledge of self is recognizing like what part of self is hurting right now, you know so yeah, there's power in therapy.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chris. We want to thank you again for joining us and being a guest participant. As you know, of course, you're invited back for the next show and any other future shows that we have, that you find hopefully relevant to speak on. Of course, you are a strong Black man doing some great, wonderful things. And, I think as a community, we can't really move forward without the two. We are not a woman's group. We are not a man's group. We are a community based um, platform to discuss community issues that include each other. So, just as a reminder of that, Sister Quilla, do you have anything else for us before we close out?
no, I mean, the audience, you all, if you have comments, questions, concerns, anything, just make sure you let us know, put them in the chat. Wonderful discussion this evening.
Absolutely. So go ahead and subscribe to our channel, to Community Culture Unveiled. Put your experience and comments in there. And I want to thank everybody for their participation tonight. I love you all. And I can't wait till we do part 2 of racial trauma. Have a good one. Take care.
Brothers, anybody, family members, if you know anyone that needs this show and it's necessary, tell them to tune in.
Community Culture Unveiled, uncovering and discussing the secrets of mental health in oppressed communities.